Emily Carter never believed that a marriage could fade without a fight, yet that was exactly what had happened in her quiet Ohio home, where days passed politely and nights felt long and empty. She and her husband Daniel still lived together, shared meals, and spoke kindly, but something essential was missing. And Emily felt it every morning when she woke up beside a man who felt emotionally miles away. Daniel worked long hours, often coming home tired and distracted, and though he never raised his voice or treated her badly, he no longer asked about her thoughts, her dreams, or the small details that once connected them. Emily tried to stay, busy filling her days with routines, errands, and neighborhood smiles, but the silence inside her followed everywhere. One Friday evening, Daniel invited his close friend Michael Brooks over for dinner, something he did occasionally, and Emily welcomed the distraction without much thought. Michael had been part of their lives for years. Someone she trusted, someone who always felt safe and familiar, like extended family. Dinner started normally with light conversation and polite laughter, but Daniel received an urgent call from work and had to leave suddenly, apologizing quickly before rushing out the door. Emily watched him go, feeling that familiar mix of understanding and disappointment, then turned back to Michael, who looked just as surprised as she was. The house grew quiet in a way that felt uncomfortable, and Emily busied herself clearing the table, trying not to think too much. Michael offered to help, and they moved around the kitchen in small, careful steps, talking about ordinary things like work, weather, and mutual friends, until the conversation slowed and settled into a pause that felt heavier than before. Emily finally sat down, letting out a tired breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And Michael looked at her for a moment longer than usual, as if deciding whether to speak. When he did, his voice was calm but honest, and he said he hoped she didn't mind him saying something personal. Emily nodded, unsure but curious, and Michael gently said that she seemed different lately, quieter, less joyful, and that he remembered a time when she laughed easily and filled a room with warmth. The words surprised her, not because they were dramatic, but because no one had said anything like that to her in a very long time. Emily felt a tight feeling in her chest and tried to brush it off with a small smile, saying she was just tired. But Michael didn't push or question her answer. He simply nodded and said he hoped things were okay. That simple concern shook her more than she expected, and for a brief moment Emily felt seen in a way that made her uncomfortable and grateful at the same time. They moved back to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between them filled with unspoken thoughts. Michael talked about Daniel, about how stressed he had been lately, about how much he cared for his family, even if he struggled to show it. And Emily listened quietly, feeling both protective and lonely. As the evening went on, rain tapped against the windows and the house felt smaller, like it was holding its breath. Emily realized she was talking more than she had in months, sharing small frustrations and quiet disappointments without naming them directly. And Michael listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, simply giving her space to speak. That alone made the night feel different, faster somehow, as if time had skipped ahead without her noticing. When Daniel texted to say he would be late, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. And she stood up, saying she needed some air. Michael followed her to the porch, where the cool night breeze cleared her head just enough to realize something important was happening, something she hadn't planned for or expected. They stood there in silence, listening to the rain, and Michael softly said that he hoped she knew she mattered, not just as Daniel's wife, but as her own person. The words landed deeply, stirring emotions Emily had buried under years of routine and patience. She didn't respond right away, afraid that if she spoke, she might reveal too much, so she simply nodded and thanked him, her voice barely steady. When Michael finally left, promising to tell Daniel goodbye, Emily closed the door behind him and leaned against it, her heart beating faster than it should have for such a simple evening. She knew nothing inappropriate had happened. No rules were broken, no lines clearly crossed. Yet she also knew that something had changed inside her, something she couldn't ignore anymore. As she turned off the lights and headed upstairs alone, Emily felt a quiet fear settle in her chest, because she sensed that this was only the beginning, and whatever came next would force her to face truths she had been avoiding for far too long. In the days that followed that quiet evening, Emily tried to return to her normal routine, but something inside her refused to settle. And every familiar moment now felt slightly different, as if the world had shifted just enough to make her notice what had always been missing. Daniel continued coming home late, tired and distracted, and while he spoke kindly, his words stayed on the surface, never reaching the deeper place Emily needed. Leaving her feeling unseen even while sitting right beside him. Michael, on the other hand, began appearing more often, always for simple reasons that sounded reasonable. Dropping off something Daniel had forgotten or stopping by briefly on his way home. And each visit was short but meaningful, carrying a calm presence that made the house feel less empty. Emily told herself not to overthink it, reminding herself that Michael was Daniel's friend and that nothing about his behavior was inappropriate. Yet she couldn't ignore how easily conversation flowed between them, or how natural it felt to be heard again. One afternoon, after a long and tiring day filled with small disappointments, Emily found herself overwhelmed by thoughts she had been pushing aside for years. And as she stood in the kitchen staring at an unpaid bill, the weight of loneliness finally caught up with her, causing her eyes to fill with tears she hadn't planned to cry. Michael had stopped by unexpectedly to return a tool, and when he noticed her standing there, struggling to stay composed, he didn't ask questions right away. He simply stayed close enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Emily tried to laugh it off, apologizing for the mess and blaming stress, but her voice broke. And the truth spilled out in pieces, not as an angry complaint, but as quiet exhaustion from carrying everything by herself. Michael listened carefully, his expression steady and respectful. And instead of offering advice or pointing out solutions, he acknowledged her feelings in a way that felt grounding, telling her it made sense to feel tired when she had been holding so much inside for so long. The moment moved quickly, not in action, but in emotion. And without fully thinking, Michael reached out and placed his hand over hers. A simple gesture meant to comfort, not claim. Yet it felt powerful enough to stop Emily's breath. The contact lasted only a second before Michael realized what he had done and gently pulled his hand back. His face filled with regret as he apologized immediately, making it clear that he never meant to cross any line. Emily nodded, unable to speak right away, her heart racing not because of the touch itself, but because of what it represented. The care and attention she had been missing from her own marriage. Michael stepped back, creating space, and said he respected her and Daniel too much to ever do anything that could cause harm, and that his concern came from a place of honesty, not desire. After he left, the kitchen felt strangely quiet. And Emily stood there, replaying the moment in her mind, realizing that no boundary had truly been crossed. Yet something deep inside her had been stirred. That night, as Daniel slept beside her, Emily stared at the ceiling, her thoughts moving fast. Not toward Michael as a person, but toward the feeling of being acknowledged, valued, and emotionally held, which hurt more than she expected. Over the next few days, Michael kept his distance. No surprise visits, no long conversations, only polite messages through Daniel. And the sudden absence made Emily confront how much those small moments had meant to her. She felt guilty for missing them, even though she knew she had done nothing wrong, and that guilt mixed with sadness in a way that left her restless and unsure. Emily began to see her marriage more clearly, not as broken, but as neglected, and that realization was painful, because it meant she had also played a part in accepting less than she needed. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, the house quiet again, Emily finally admitted to herself that what had shaken her was not Michael's brief touch, but the reminder that she still had a heart capable of feeling deeply. And that truth hit her hard, because it forced her to question how long she could continue living in emotional silence without losing herself completely. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the brief moments with Michael, and as days turned into weeks, she realized that his absence now weighed on her more than his presence ever had, making her see her own marriage with Daniel in sharper relief. Noticing the cracks she had ignored for years, the quiet distance that had grown like a shadow between them. Daniel was still kind, still loving in his own way, but he was consumed by work, distracted by responsibilities, and never quite present in the way Emily longed for, leaving her to navigate her feelings and her life largely alone. Michael, aware of the tension he had unintentionally stirred, began stepping back, sending polite messages through Daniel, small gestures of care that were respectful but emotionally charged in their restraint, each message reminding Emily of the connection she had briefly felt, the acknowledgement of her inner life, and the comfort of someone truly seeing her. Emily tried to bury her thoughts, focusing on chores, errands, and keeping the house in order, but every empty room, every quiet evening, felt heavier than before, and she found herself thinking about Michael in ways that confused her. She did not want him, she did not want to betray her husband, yet the clarity and attention he had offered highlighted what she had been missing for years, stirring emotions she could no longer ignore. One evening, Daniel casually mentioned that Michael was moving to Vancouver, Canada, for a new job opportunity, and Emily felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. A mix of sadness and relief she could not immediately understand. When Michael arrived to say goodbye in person, Emily noticed how nervous he seemed, how carefully he measured his words and actions, and she realized that he, too, had struggled with the weight of unspoken emotions during their brief but meaningful interactions. Michael admitted that he had crossed a line not in action but in emotional intimacy, acknowledging that while he never intended to act on feelings inappropriately, his attentiveness had stirred emotions he could not control, emotions he knew could complicate Emily's life. Emily listened, her heart racing, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and heartbreak as she understood the truth in his words, realizing that the discomfort and excitement she had felt were not signs of desire for Michael himself, but for the recognition, attention, and care that had been absent from her marriage for far too long. He told her that walking away was the only responsible choice, that his presence had reminded her of her own needs, but that he could not risk being a source of conflict or temptation. And Emily, though sad, respected his honesty and self-control, recognizing a depth of character and integrity she found rare and admirable. After Michael left, Emily was left alone in the quiet house with thoughts spinning. But something inside her had shifted permanently. She understood that the longing she had felt was not for another man, but for being seen, valued, and emotionally connected, feelings she had been denying herself in her marriage. She began reflecting on the choices she had made, the ways she had settled into routine and silence instead of speaking openly with Daniel, realizing that her own avoidance had allowed distance to grow between them. The brief encounter with Michael had acted like a mirror, showing her exactly what she wanted and what she had been missing. And the revelation hurt because it made the reality unavoidable. If she wanted to feel alive and loved, she could not wait for Daniel to notice on his own. She had to speak, to act, to bring the truth into the open. That night, Emily lay awake, replaying every word Michael had said, every look and gesture, feeling both the sting of absence and the clarity it brought, and she resolved not to let the lesson be wasted. She realized that her marriage could still be saved, but only if she confronted the issues, expressed her loneliness, and allowed Daniel the chance to understand her fully, not just superficially. The days following Michael's departure were quiet, almost painfully so, but Emily found a strange strength in the silence, a determination to act, to reclaim her emotional life rather than letting it drift further into emptiness. She thought about the conversations they had shared, about the small moments of being truly heard, and she recognized that this awareness was a gift. Painful yet necessary, forcing her to take responsibility for her own happiness and emotional fulfillment. Emily began to prepare herself for a conversation with Daniel, mentally rehearsing honesty without blame, openness without resentment, understanding that the experience with Michael had been a catalyst, a wake-up call that she could not ignore. She finally saw clearly that the heart of the issue was not attraction or temptation, but emotional neglect, and that realization made the need for change urgent, compelling her to face the truth before the distance between her and Daniel became permanent. By the time she went to sleep, Emily felt a mixture of sorrow, clarity, and resolve, knowing that her emotions had been stirred for a reason and that the next steps she took would determine whether she allowed herself to remain isolated in her marriage or fought for the connection she had been craving, inspired by the brief, honest presence of someone who had reminded her what it felt like to be truly seen. After Michael left for Vancouver, the house felt emptier than ever, and Emily realized the quiet wasn't just absence, it was a reflection of how much she had been missing in her own life. The brief but meaningful connection with Michael had shaken her, forcing her to confront the truth she had ignored for years. Her marriage with Daniel, though stable on the surface, lacked the emotional closeness she desperately needed. She couldn't stop thinking about the contrast between the warmth of being truly seen and the polite distance she lived with daily. That realization was painful, but it also sparked a determination she hadn't felt in a long time. Emily knew that if she wanted things to change, she had to act, to be honest with Daniel instead of waiting for him to notice on his own. One evening, as Daniel sat on the couch scrolling through his phone after another long day, Emily took a deep breath and started talking, choosing her words carefully but speaking with honesty. She explained how lonely she had felt, how she had struggled quietly with the emotional distance between them, and how small moments of acknowledgement and care could have made a world of difference. Daniel listened at first silently, his expression unreadable, and Emily felt a familiar pang of fear that he might not understand or care. But as she continued, she noticed a shift in his posture, a quiet attentiveness she hadn't seen in years. She didn't blame him or Michael. She simply spoke about her feelings and the longing she had kept inside, about the small ways she needed connection, support, and recognition. Things that didn't require grand gestures, only presence and understanding. Daniel finally set his phone aside and reached for her hand. And for the first time in months, Emily felt the beginning of a bridge forming between them. The conversation was not easy. There were pauses, moments of silence, and tears from both of them as they confronted the reality of years of neglect and unspoken emotions. Yet in that difficult honesty, there was also hope. Daniel admitted he had been overwhelmed with work, responsibilities, and the pressure to provide, and in doing so, he realized he had unintentionally withdrawn from the person who mattered most. Emily felt a mix of relief and sadness, knowing that the awareness alone wasn't enough, but that it was the first step toward real change. Together, they decided to seek counseling not because it was a simple solution, but because they recognized that rebuilding their emotional connection required effort, communication, and willingness from both sides. Over the following weeks, they committed to being present, to sharing their days, to noticing each other again. And each small success, like a shared laugh over coffee in the morning or a quiet walk in the evening, felt like a victory after years of routine silence. Emily noticed that even Daniel's small gestures, a hand on her back, a thoughtful question about her day, made her feel valued and loved, and slowly, the house transformed from a space of quiet loneliness into a home where warmth could return. Months later, Emily received a postcard from Michael, brief and simple, wishing her happiness and telling her he hoped she was smiling again. She smiled at the message, feeling no guilt, only gratitude for the role he had played in awakening her to her own needs and the importance of honesty in her life. Michael had never crossed a line, Yet he had reminded her what it meant to feel alive, seen, and appreciated. And that reminder had been the catalyst for the change she and Daniel had begun to build together. Emily finally understood that life could be painful, that human connections could stir complicated emotions, but that the right choices, honesty, and effort could transform even the quietest house into a home filled with love and understanding. She reflected on how easily she had accepted distance before, how she had tolerated routine over emotional presence, and she vowed not to let that happen again. The experience taught her that love required attention, care, and courage to speak the truth, and that sometimes the hardest moments were necessary to awaken people to what truly mattered. As Emily and Daniel continued their journey, they faced challenges, but now with a new foundation built on awareness, communication, and mutual respect. And Emily felt a quiet strength in knowing that the feelings stirred by Michael's presence had not led to betrayal, but had illuminated the path to rediscovering love within her own marriage. By confronting her emotions, speaking honestly, and allowing herself to be vulnerable, Emily found that relationships could grow stronger, deeper, and more resilient. And she finally understood that the hardest truths often lead to the most meaningful transformations. In the end, Emily realized that the experience had been a gift disguised as emotional turbulence. A reminder that being seen, heard, and understood was the core of love, and that choosing to rebuild and cherish her marriage with Daniel was the path to lasting happiness, leaving her hopeful, fulfilled, and ready for whatever life brought next.